went down to 80 fish in 1985, but because of the co-management authority that Judge Boldt reaffirmed, we were able to go in and negotiate with Puget Sound Energy and give them a plan for recovery. It was a plan that called for hatchery production, improved fish passage, and also a goal and objective of getting that run size to 100,000 fish. Now, why is that important? Because 100,000 fish, because the highest recorded historical high that we could ever document was in the low 20,000 range. And so it took the power of the co-management and the tribe to go in and negotiate with Puget Sound and get them to agree to this deal. In fact, the state was very mad at us at the time because we would dare go in and negotiate and an agreement for salmon recovery without them. Now, you can say we did it for our tribal members, for our people, for our kids and our future, but the reality is we did it for everybody. This year, we nearly saw 100,000 fish return. So having that fish run go from 85 fish to 100,000, that's so much.
Also, what are some ideas that you have for how we can best support recovery of fish populations in the Skagit and other river systems?
You want me to go first? Well, right now what we're working on, we're negotiating with Seattle City Light to open up 40% of the river that has been historically blocked off by the dams. So we've got the city to agree to implement fish passage on the 3 upper Skagit dams. And that, in theory, will open up, 40% of the watershed for restoration, for salmon recovery. We can build these runs back up higher because in my lifetime, we've seen many of these runs, again, disappear or diminish to. This 2025, we saw a summer Chinook run that nearly historically low. So where we're going now, by opening up the river, we're gonna have extra areas for the salmon to I'm struggling there.
Scott's amazing. So, if you think about it, we've had a lot of problems with our rivers in the past. It's been a big fight to consider having people become aware of the issues that are going on in the rivers and how the rivers actually affect our ecosystem. I think people kind of focus on, whether they're in the ocean or whether it's the Salish Sea, and they forget about the small things like the rivers and the creeks and the streams. And we have in the past, so I'm from the Lummi Nation. My father was Jim Wilson, my mother was Roberta Wilson, and a lot like Doreen Maloney, and I love your mother, by the way, she's amazing, she's just an icon. My father was on the Fish Commission for many years and was on the tribal council. And a lot of this stuff happened in the Judge Boldt decision and the early beginnings of the tribal councils, as they said in the film, back in the early 60s and early 70s. And I was a child back then. And so watching my father grow up in this and Doreen, an amazing icon in this field of traditional ways of being, in my opinion. I wouldn't necessarily call it work, because I think that both Scott and I, grew up in families where this is what they did for their way of life. It wasn't necessarily something that they just did for a job. They went there with passion and deep concern about what would happen in the future if they didn't protect what they knew was something that we had over thousands and thousands of years. And so this isn't just something, co-management isn't just something that we decided to do because it was a good idea. Co-management is something that we have to do in order to protect and preserve our traditional ways of being. And so I think it runs deeper for us. But in that conversation about the rivers, we actually have the Nooksack River in our area, and there's a lot going on that river right now. And I believe that we're all working towards making sure that our rivers are just as important and relevant as terminal fishing and area fishing and co-management.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's open up for audience questions. maybe the runners can help me see.
I want to say that's a challenging question because I believe that if you looked at the idea that wild fish could come back in the state of the way things had been in the last, say, 40, 50 years, they would probably have a chance. And I think more than anything, tribes would like wild fish, but I also believe that if we don't start doing what it takes to reverse some of the problems that we're having with, one of the things, and I'm going to mention her name again, what Lisa says is we have permitting processes that make it easier to develop permitting processes that make it easier on treatment plants than it does for us to maintain our hatcheries. And we have to look at what's going to work for all of us. I think that's more of the big question. I think you're asking a question to actually answer or to ask more questions. Because if we just stay on the surface of some of these issues, we're not going to get to the bottom of them. And a lot of our responsibility, yours and mine, ours, and thank God for Washington State. Thank God for Washington State for being such a smart people. Because I think we have an opportunity here to prove to the rest of the world that working for the environment is going to be our way out too.
I don't know if it is working. Imagine that. I recently attended a conference in Portland, run in Unity, about the Snake River dams. And so this is not confined to Skagit County, the dams issues and the outlaw. It's also happening in Southwest Washington and Oregon. From your perspectives, what can the people in this room do in 6 months, in a year, in 5 years to protect your life?
That's a great question. Our way of life, I'd like to just say that, work with local organizations, groups like the Fisheries Enhancement Group, all these organizations that protect and enhance salmon on the Skagit. The question about the hatcheries, a second ago, we had 3 fisheries this year in the Skagit. We would have only had 1 this year had not have been for hatchery production. And these are necessary for us to have value to the treaty. Again, this treaty only has meaning as long as we have fish to fish on. Otherwise, it's an empty right that doesn't give us meaning. The Boldt decision did a lot of things for many tribes. Again, I'm going to go off on a little, sorry. It brought my tribe back together. We didn't have a reservation, and so after the decision came down, it brought us back to the river where our people could gather, and then we eventually got a reservation of our own. But you can protect the way of life, your way of life. It's our way of life, because it's a quality of life. The fact that we do have salmon on the Skagit, all 6 species of salmon, is a good thing, and we need to cherish that and protect that and continue to work towards maintaining these runs are still here, because as long as they're here, that means we have a good quality of life.
I just want to add one thing. I don't want us to forget, this is obviously a story of fish, but we also have gathering and hunting. If we look at it as a whole, we look at it as a whole, we're a part of, we've been given this great gift of the environment. Obviously, I'm a cedar weaver. I weave and harvest. I harvest cedar in the summertime, and then I create beautiful and practical items out of it. It's one of the things that I think is something that people don't really think about when they're thinking about the habitat or the ecosystem. We also have to consider the way that the warming trends and the way that we're getting bigger king tides and we're getting more flooding. You know, there's things that are happening because of our development, or because of, you know, the way that the pollution is gaining on us. And we personally can't, one person can't do something in 6 months, you know, to protect those things. But what we can do overall is gotta be a movement. You know, we have to create a movement that raises people's consciousness to the idea that these things are important to us. They're important to you, they're important to me. The air that we breathe, you know, the water we drink, you know, we have to start raising a consciousness. And a part of that is also being good neighbors. You know, I would have to say that a lot of this campaign that this movie has brought about was being closer to and getting to know each other. Because if we keep looking at each other like we're all indifferent, like somehow I'm different than you and you're different than me, that started in the Judge Boldt decision for me. And you know, and when I was a kid in elementary school, getting called all kinds of names because I was an Indian, and I didn't know that the problem was that half the teachers that I was being taught by were fishermen and were being pissed off at the Judge Boldt decision. I mean, I was just a kid, you know? And so I think that a lot of times, you know, when I, even today when we go about, you know, let's be kinder. Let's be more open to one another. Let's see what each other's about. You know, we all have families and we all have a life that we have to live, and we can do it better together than we can separate, in my opinion.
So I want to say thank you for bringing this important film and your powerful efforts to this evening. And my question, and I want to say Aishka for the protection of habitat, the protection of fish, the protection of the rivers, and the protections of the families and the history. What could you share a little bit of your thoughts about the other end of the spectrum? The salmon and their winter, or their long habitats are out in the Alaskan waters far from here. The Sacramento River salmon are not really Alaskan salmon. The Klamath River salmon are not really Alaskan salmon. The Fraser River salmon are not really Alaskan salmon, but there's a fishery up there as well. And if you could maybe share your thoughts on that. Thank you. Aishka.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the whole part of, you know, but about the salmon migration, you know, they're all intermingled, and it affects all the salmon runs. You know, one of the things that I've learned recently when I went to London to speak at a salmon conference was Europe is facing the same problems that we're seeing here. And you know, one of the things that we've learned are that pinks are going to inherit the world. In fact, pig runs are inundating many of the migratory areas and are impacting some of the salmon runs like chum right now. And I know that probably doesn't answer your question, but you know, it's a big concern about salmon migration and what's going on in the high seas in these areas. And what can we do? Not quite sure we have an answer right now how to address that, but we do need a global effort. And that was the message that I had in London. It has to be a global effort and a global interest to preserve salmon runs throughout the world, and it's going to take all of us, not just one person, one tribe. It takes the whole population of the earth.
That kind of reminds me of a story. We had seen something in the very beginning of in one of the commercials for Salmon Defense before this movie. About the salmon people. And what's really interesting about that is some people like to call the early part of our history where Native people went from area to area to follow the salmon, which they did. And somebody had said, were you guys nomadic? And I'm like, no, we weren't nomadic. Well, did you move? No, we didn't move. And what that reminded me of was when one of the gentlemen was talking in the film, he was saying about the time when his dad got put in jail for fishing, and then his aunt and his mother had to go out on their boat, and then they got arrested. Well, if you looked behind, after a shot of that, they had showed a picture of where they had originally were living back in the day when they were getting arrested. Well, what's really interesting about that is all the tribes had those summer camps, was what they were originally. They were summer camps. And everybody we were cyclical. We would move with the salmon. We were so amazing. We knew exactly where the salmon were going to be. We knew exactly what season to fish. We knew exactly when we needed to be there. And it was just, I used to call our old fishermen back in the day, I used to call them, more than a man and less than a god, because how would they know all that? How would they know that? That's such an amazing thing to try to think about. In one of the things that, if you've seen that shack that the gentleman was talking about, our summer camps didn't need winter insulation because they were only there for the summer. And they ended up there because of the putting Indians on reservations. And in that area where that reservation was the summer camp. And so, it always boggled my mind when I remembered, because I was probably like maybe 1 or 2, and it was the same time that we had, that the government was sending people on a relocation act. I'm not giving my age away, am I? And when we actually went to Tacoma, and a lot of our tribal members and families went into inner cities. It was a part of a simulation. And when we went to those areas, we would come back and we would stay in those shacks because we didn't have anything but what we were left with. And so if you think about, like, oh my gosh, we didn't see ourselves as poor. There was plenty of resources around us to have. And when we went back and forth from Tacoma to Lummi, when we stayed in those shacks, it was the summertime, and I always wondered where those shacks came from and why we were there. I remember our elders would say, oh yeah, so-and-so moved out of that shack, and then so-and-so bought it for $5, and then they lived there, and then so-and-so moved over there. And I realized that, it was a displacement. They were displaced because of one, moving on the reservation, and then 2, being relocated to inner cities. And a lot of those inner city people, like the Black Panthers, were talking about protest at that time. And so if you think about how history moved and how Indians kind of grabbed onto it and said, yeah, we really need to, we do have rights, that there was the Black Panthers and all those big movements rising up, and then, we came back from the Relocation Act, and that's about the time that Medicine Creek was having their big fight, and everybody jumped in. Everybody knew that was not okay, and that we needed to figure that out. And it boggles my mind to go back in history and look at all of those reasons why things like that happen. And there's always a reason. There was always a reason. There was a reason why those shacks were there. We just didn't make shacks. We had a life way before that, right? Just something I thought it was so amazing.
I think it's getting where we probably should let people think about getting off. Right now, as we speak, for hunting in their ancestral areas, so that the court case goes on and on. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality.
Well, thank you both very much for coming tonight and speaking and sharing with us. We have a gift for you all.